While forward facing has been incredibly effective and basically changed the entire sport of bass fishing, there has been a bait that has sort of sneakily dominated over the past 5 or 6 years and gone relatively unspoken about, and that is the Neko Rig. Now, this is sort of coming out in mainstream media. You're hearing guys start to talk about this quite a bit with relation to forward-facing sonar, but the Neko Rig is a deadly tool with and without forward-facing to help you catch bass. Let's dive into this thing. Now, looking back at the Bassmaster Elite on Okeechobee, Brandon Polinick won basically in dominating fashion. And one of the baits that he really relied on day 3 of that tournament was a Neko Rig. On day 1, he caught him cranking and throwing a big swim bait. On day 2, he caught him cranking. On day 3, when those fish started to turn off, he really had to rely on the Neko Rig to go out and have a lot of success to trick those finicky fish into biting his bait. And this is a bait that has really dominated kind of sneakily over the past 5 or 6 years. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Benjamin Nowak, and this channel is dedicated to teaching you bass fishing tips, taking you on the water for my trips, and teaching you about baits like a Neko Rig to help you go out and catch more bass. So if you guys enjoy that style of content and you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button down below, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with a friend that might not know about the Neko Rig that wants to catch more fish. I can still remember the first fish that I caught on a Neko Rig, and it was in its infancy. It was still a bait that was so unknown, so unspoken of, and really there wasn't any content out about it. And it was actually with my buddy Mr. Mikey Balls. We were down in Florida, and he had gotten on this technique pretty early on some of those Florida lakes with a Gambler Fatty, a 6-inch. He cast it out there, and he was catching giant largemouth on this thing in Florida. It was 2016, 2017 when that happened. I actually have some old videos of that. But then I kind of put it away, forgot about it, and it came back onto the scene, as I mentioned in the introduction, in 2019 when I was following around Brian Schmidt on the FLW Tour. Now, he wasn't one of the only guys throwing it. There were a lot of guys doing it, but he was having a lot of success and sneakily had a phenomenal year in Angler of the Year and even had a really, really good tournament down on Lake Hamilton throwing an Neko Rig and brush piles. And that really reinvigorated my spark to throw this bait more up here in the Midwest. And I had a couple really close finishes. I won a couple local tournaments fishing a Neko Rig around other guys that were fishing the grass lines with jigs or drop shots or Ned rigs or wacky rigs. This Neko Rig is just a unique presentation that allows you to catch fish that don't want to bite other finesse techniques. It's a very natural presentation in the water, and to most people it just looks like a wacky rigged worm. But what makes a Neko Rig so special, and this is how we're going to start, what makes a Neko Rig so special is that inside the head of that bait there is actually a weight. In this worm there's a 3/32 ounce nail weight in the head of that worm. You guys can kind of tell it's pretty rigid. And what that will do is not only cause this worm to still have action on the fall, it'll give it a faster fall rate, and when you work this bait along bottom, you can fish it tail up. So when you're working this bait along, nose down, worm on bottom, you can shake this bait, and it has a lot of unique action as opposed to just a standard wacky rig, which when you work that bait, the whole worm's going to come off bottom and shimmy back down. This worm will have a nose down fall. It'll look like a dying bait fish swimming through the water, but it will also have that shimmy and be able to stay nose down when you're fishing this bait along the bottom. So talking about that weight is actually going to lead me into the first point about Neko Rig fishing, which is probably the most critical aspect of Neko Rig fishing, and that is rate of fall, the amount of weight that you use to get this bait to go through the water column to trigger fish to bite. So my rule of thumb is I want to start with the lightest weight I can possibly use to get this bait on bottom and fish it effectively. I think the lighter the weight you go, the more time those fish have to track this bait through the water, and it also makes this worm look a lot more natural when you're working it on bottom. So most of the time my go-to weight is like 1/16 or 3/32 of an ounce. That's going to let me fish this bait in about 10 to 12 foot or less. When I get a little bit deeper, maybe go up to 3/32 or 1/8 of an ounce. And then if I get any deeper than that, you can kind of upsize if you want. But because this is such a finesse presentation, a lot of times I try not to go over 1/8 of an ounce. I guess if you're smallmouth fishing on really heavy wind and current, you can go heavier than that. I have gone heavier than that. But for me, 1/8 of an ounce and below is where I try to stay with a Neko rigged worm. So rate of fall is critically important. And one thing that I mentioned in the introduction is you don't need forward-facing sonar to use this bait effectively. One of the first times I ever used this was without forward-facing. I was fishing a grass patch, and they stopped biting my jig, so I took a Neko Rig, and I fished this in that grass patch, and I was able to reignite that school of fish that was sitting around that grass. And one of the really cool things is that you can use it as a really effective follow-up tool when those fish will get off other techniques, and it's something that While it is mainstream, it's still not fish maybe as much as it should be, especially when you have other baits like a drop shot, a wacky rig, a Ned rig, that guys are fishing in those areas. This is something sneaky you can pick up to get those fish to bite. While point one was about rate of fall, point two is going to be about the size of the plastic and the profile of the plastic that you choose to use. Because, believe it or not, this will also have a big impact on rate of fall. If you're using a big bulky plastic, because it doesn't have to be limited to worm style baits, you might want to go to a little bit heavier weight. If you're using a really small bait like a 4-inch robo worm, which we'll talk about here in a minute, you can go to a lighter size weight and still have the same rate of fall as if you're using those bigger, bulkier plastics. Now, what I have rigged up now, and one of my favorite worms for this technique, is a 6-inch robo worm fat. All of this gear will be linked down in the description below, but the 6-inch robo worm fat is going to be my first go-to. I think it's a really natural presentation. It's not too big. You can fish it for smallmouth or largemouth, and pretty much on all of your northern fisheries, this 6-inch robo worm fat is going to be a really, really good size and profile as a starting point. Now, if maybe they're not eating it quite as well as they should, or you're getting short strikes, or those fish don't seem to want to eat this bait maybe as effectively as they did the day prior or in days past, you can adjust the profile of this bait up or down to trigger those fish into biting. A couple of my other favorites are this 4.5-inch just standard robo worm. This is actually a bait that I used to win big bass and win a tournament last spring on. Just a small 4.5-inch robo worm. It's a lot more finesse presentation. It's really, really natural. You go to a lighter size weight. I think I was using a 1/16 of an ounce, or maybe even went down to like a 1/32. Just a really, really finesse, small presentation profile, because sometimes you have to downsize a little bit. It was slick calm. Those fish were getting really pressured. There were a bunch of other boats on the water, so those fish wanted a smaller presentation. Another worm that I like to use is the Berkeley Max Scent Hit Worm. I'm a big believer in scent, and the hit worm is a really unique profile, and I'll show you that here in a second, because my other favorite is the 7-inch Magnum hit worm. And while it looks like a really big profile and presentation, which it is slightly bigger than your 6-inch robo worm fat, this Magnum hit worm just seems to get bites when a lot of other presentations won't. While it is a little bit bigger profile worm, it's not going to keep you from catching those 1 to 2 pound fish or just getting bites. And that, I think, is the beauty of this technique. It will get you a lot of bites when other baits don't seem to catch fish as effectively. And beyond that, it will trigger some of the biggest bites in your lake from those really pressured and intelligent fish. And I really love a Neko Rig because it is just a fish catcher, and it will trigger those giant ones to bite. And I mentioned earlier that you don't have to use just worm style baits for this presentation. However, that's really all that I've utilized so far. I have played with some creature bait presentations a little bit, but never into the big bluegill style bait that you saw Taku use on Smith Lake at last year, or some of the other baits that you're seeing guys utilize for this technique. But it is something you can do. Just pay attention to that rate of fall and the way that bait comes through the water and how those fish are reacting to that bait, because as I mentioned in point one, in my opinion, rate of fall is the most critical aspect when you're fishing a Neko Rig. And then point number 3 is going to be focus on the cover that you're fishing. So if you're fishing open water situations, you're fishing really sparse grass or areas where there's not a lot of cover, I like to utilize an open hook as much as possible. In my opinion, this is going to maximize the amount of bites that I land and get into the boat. You don't have anything impeding that hook, so if you can get away with an open hook, I really, really like to use that style of hook. But if you're fishing around heavier cover, there's wood on the bottom, you're fishing around these really thick grassy areas, you can go with those weedless style hooks, which I'll put up some pictures of here. But those weedless style hooks, in my opinion, have the potential to limit the hook to land ratio on your bite. And for me, I'm trying to maximize my hook to land ratio. The best opportunity to do that, in my opinion, is to use an open hook. So the only time I go to those weedless style hooks is if I'm fishing around some sort of cover. And obviously cover is really important anytime you're bass fishing, whether you're fishing around grass or rock or wood or docks is a great place to throw a Neko Rig as well. Pay attention to the cover you're fishing around, and that's really going to dictate not only the hook that you use, the size weight that you're using, the profile bait that you're using to match the situation. Paying attention to those different factors like the cover that you're fishing is going to impact the entire bait setup for your Neko Rig. And finally, this isn't necessarily a tip, but it's something that I want to tell you guys about, and probably something that I see get wrong a decent bit is the position of the hook in the bait. A lot of times when guys are wacky rigging, in my opinion, the best way to wacky rig a bait is to go through that bait sideways, right? So your hook is perpendicular to your bait, right? The hook point is perpendicular through the side of the bait. However, when you're Neko rigging, one thing that I believe is important is to put the weight down and your hook point facing away from the weight. Now, why do I believe this is really, really important with this technique? Well, when you're dragging this bait or fishing this bait along bottom, and those fish come up and they eat that bait, that hook point is going to be facing upwards. So when you set the hook, it's going to set the hook into the top of their mouth, as opposed to sideways, or if you rig it the opposite direction where the hook point is actually facing the weight, and you go to set the hook into those fish, you're going to have this flat side of your hook, the shank, into the top of their mouth, so they're going to have to roll that bait before they can actually get the hook point. So in my opinion, it's very, very important to pay attention to the way that you rig your bait with a Neko rig. You want to rig your hook point away from the weighted part of the worm. And then I recommend using, whether it's a wacky O-ring or these tubing pieces, to rig your bait. It's going to make your baits last a lot longer. It's going to make them stay on the hook a little bit more, and save you some money and make you more efficient when you're fishing a Neko rig. So those are my 4 tips to recommend for you guys when you're fishing a Neko rig. Number 1, pay attention to rate of fall. In my opinion, it is the most important part of Neko rig fishing. Paying attention to that rate of fall will maximize the number of bites you're getting. Number 2, paying attention to the profile and size bait you're using will impact the rate of fall and help you get more fish to bite. Pay attention to the cover that you're fishing is point number 3, and changing your profile, changing your bait, changing your weight, changing your entire setup for the cover that you're fishing. And point number 4, rig your hook point facing away from the weighted section of your bait. Hopefully these steps will help you go out and catch more fish on a Neko rig this year and give you the confidence you need to fish a Neko rig more effectively. If you guys enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already, and stay tuned for more content like this. Let me know what types of content you'd like to see in the future. If you guys want to see a video talking about when I fish a bladed jig over a swim jig and vice versa, click this video right here. If you're not subscribed already, hit that button right there. It'll subscribe you to the channel, let you know when I post more videos just like this. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check out the links down in the description for all the gear that I mentioned in today's video. And as always, take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.